In this lesson, we're going to be talking about our first animal phylum, Phylum Porifera. First, let's review. An animal is a multicellular eukaryotic heterotrophic organism whose cells lack cell walls. Animals feed, respirate, circulate, excrete, respond, move, and reproduce. So let's look at an organism. And perhaps another, and another, and another. All four of these organisms are animals. They may not look like it, but they do fit the definition of what an animal is. And so I want you to think about that definition as we go through this lesson. These sponges may not look like an animal. They don't have eyes, they don't have blood, they don't have lungs they use to breathe with, but they are animals because they're multicellular, eukaryotic, heterotrophic organisms whose cells lack cell walls. So let's talk a little bit about what they are. Porifera literally means pore bearers. Pore means pore and fera means bearing, so porifera literally means pore bearing or pore bearers. The common name for organisms in phylum Porifera is sponges. So you'll hear me refer to organisms in phylum Porifera three ways. I'll either call them phylum Porifera, poriferans, or sponges. The name sponge is appropriate because they have tiny holes all over their bodies and they look kind of like a sponge. When you think of a sponge that lives under the sea, you may think of SpongeBob SquarePants. But SpongeBob wasn't modeled after a sea sponge. He was modeled after a synthetic sponge that you could find in your kitchen. What we're talking about are living organisms. This is what's left over from a sea sponge after its cells have died and been cleaned away. So this is kind of like a skeleton of a sea sponge. Now, these are used commercially. Some companies harvest dead sea sponges and use them and sell them as sponges or body sponges or car sponges or whatever. Not every sponge you see in a store was once a living organism, but this was. And so let's talk about how sponges fulfill the 7 survival characteristics, and that'll help us understand why they're classified as animals. Sponges are simple. They're one of the simplest forms of animal life on Earth. They have been around at least 540 million years, making them some of the most ancient of animals. They do have specialized cells, but there are no organs or organ systems. And I'll add to this, no tissues either. Their cells have different functions, but they don't work together like tissues or organs do. There are several types of specialized cells, but the one you need to know about is the choanocyte or the collar cell. So this is a picture of a choanocyte. The choanocytes are placed in the inner wall of the sponge, and they have this little collar on them. That's why they're called collar cells. The collar helps trap food. But perhaps the most important function of the choanocyte is this flagellum. And this flagellum beats and drives water through the sponge. So as the flagella go back and forth, it draws water from the outside of the sponge in through the sponge and out. And you'll see a good example of this in a video you'll watch after this teacher video. And that's the choanocyte's function, is to draw water through the sponge. It's used to move a steady stream of water through the sponge. This is how the sponge feeds, respirates, circulates, and excretes. So this choanocyte is very important for the animal to survive. Feeding. So now we're going to be talking about the 7 survival characteristics and how sponges accomplish them. Sponges are filter feeders. So they use that choanocyte, they pump water through their bodies, and they collect the tiny food particles that are in the water. Digestion is intracellular, meaning it takes place inside the cells. Now this is different from you and me. Our digestion is extracellular. It happens outside of our cells. So for example, our food goes down into our stomach where it's dissolved by acids, digested by acids. and it never really enters the cells in the stomach. And so all of that digestion happens outside of our cells. But with sponges, they take the tiny microscopic food particles and bring them into the cells, and then they're digested inside of the cells. As the water moves through the sponge, food particles are trapped by the choanocytes, and then the digested food particles are passed on to other cells. Respiration, circulation, and excretion. This is all done by the movement of water using the choanocytes. So the water surrounding the sponge and the water moving through the sponge takes away carbon dioxide and waste and brings nutrients and oxygen to each of the sponge's cells. So the sponge uses water for respiration, circulation, and excretion. It uses the diffusion of water, or the diffusion of materials into the water, using the help of the choanocytes. Response. Sponges do not have nerve cells. So I'm kind of taking a step back from our last lesson. I said all animals have nerves that help them respond to their environment. Sponges don't have nerves. So they're kind of the exception to the rule. However, they do produce toxins that make them unpalatable or poisonous to potential predators. So they have evolved this response mechanism, these toxins, that help them survive. And so we count this as response, and because the sponge fits all of the other animal requirements, it still is classified as an animal, even though it doesn't have any nerves. So movement. As adults, sponges do not move. This is called sessile. You'll need to know that. Sessile means they don't move. The only time they do move is as a larva or an immature sponge. So this is a drawing of the life cycle of a poriferan. And when it's a little larva, so after an egg and a sperm have combined and it's grown into a little ball, this little ball gets flagellum that move around, and it can move and set itself on a surface and then grow and become sessile. Sponges reproduce. They may reproduce asexually or sexually. Sponges reproduce asexually by budding. This is when a part of the sponge breaks off of the parent, settles down onto the seafloor, and grows into a new sponge. So here's a picture of a sea sponge budding, and that bud will eventually fall off and fall onto the floor and become a bigger sponge. Sponges do reproduce sexually. They produce egg and sperm at different times. So you may have two sponges that are next to each other that are of the same species, and one will produce egg and one will produce sperm. And then the sperm from the one sponge enters another through the water, and the eggs are fertilized inside of the sponge, and that's called internal fertilization because it happens inside the body of the sponge. The egg and the sperm meet and form a larva, which swims around and eventually lands. This is a picture of a sponge producing sperm. So all of the sperm floats around in the water, and hopefully some of the sperm ends up in another sponge of the same species and fertilizes an egg and will create a new sponge. Sponges are important creatures, animals that live in the ocean. So for some of our animal phyla, I'm going to be talking about their ecology, why they're important to ecosystems around the world. So sponges are homes for other sea life. This is a little crab that lives inside a sponge. The sponge protects the crab, and in turn the crab will eat, and some of those little food particles that fall away from the crab the sponge can take up. Sponges also form symbiotic relationships with bacteria, algae, and plant-like protists. They provide homes for these symbionts, and the symbionts provide the sponge with food. So this sponge is green because it has a symbiosis with an algae. The algae is making food. The sponge gets some of that food that the algae produces, and the algae gets a nice safe home within the sponge. So that's all about poriferans, at least for me. You'll now watch an excellent video to learn more about sponges, and there are some other additional materials for you to read to learn more.